Well, my name is Boyd Pickard.
And I'm Chris Budnick.
Hey, everybody. Awesome. Okay, this presentation right here is called Narcotics Anonymous, the Early Story. And it's a presentation that explores the rise of addiction and the emergence of Narcotics Anonymous as a pathway to recovery. And there was a while back I was looking up the definition of history. And the one that I came across that I really liked was, it's an interpretation of events told in a chronological manner. And what you're going to get tonight is pretty chronological manner of events, but the key word in that definition is interpretation. This is Chris's and I's interpretation based on the research that we have done for the events that we're going to show you. And this right here is a picture of a man by the name of William White, who is Chris and I's mentor. And we were able to partner with him starting in 2009. And we ended up writing an article with him called Narcotics Anonymous, Its History and Its Culture. And so if you would like to read the article, you can just Google that, Narcotics Anonymous, Its History and Its Culture, or you can go to williamwhitepapers.com and you can find it on that. So Bill is still, we still do projects with him. He's just been a huge resource and a person that both Chris and I have looked to for guidance, really and truly. And where Bill learned a lot of his stuff was from this man right here. This is Ernie Kurtz, who wrote a book called Not God that was published in 1979. And it was Not God, the History of Alcoholics Anonymous. And it was probably the first scholarly work that was done on the history of AA. And Ernie's a Harvard-trained professor, and Bill came to him, I believe, in the year 2000-ish, or before, actually, before slaying the dragon, and he asked Ernie to help him with, get on the right track with his history of AA. And so with that.
So there are a few things we're going to explore in the presentation, and this is to provide a little bit of context. Narcotics Anonymous emerged with inspiration and influence of Alcoholics Anonymous. It emerged during a heroin drug trend. It emerged when there were very few treatment and no community-based resources. It emerged when society did not believe that persons addicted to drugs other than alcohol could ever find recovery. And during a decade of increasingly harsh criminal justice responses to heroin addiction. It also emerged out of multiple addict-initiated efforts to create mutual aid recovery support, and we'll talk about some of those examples today. Some of the overviews and themes that are kind of questions that we've explored as we've done this research is, what would it have been like if you were an addict born before the emergence of Narcotics Anonymous? What would your experience have been like? Why was there the need for something other than Alcoholics Anonymous for addicts? What other 12-step fellowships attempted to help addicts? Why do the 12 traditions matter? Where should addicts find recovery? And we'll cover discussion that we researched that looks at them finding recovery in Alcoholics Anonymous or in addict-only groups. What are some of the distinguishing features of Narcotics Anonymous? And a really kind of big question, which is, how did it become possible for addicts to meet for recovery without fear of surveillance or of being arrested? But to provide a little context, we explore the rise of addiction, and there's really three contributing factors. One is innovations of drugs, the second is innovations in drug administration, and the third is innovations in drug marketing. So innovations in drugs. There were isolation of specific alkaloids that made drugs more powerful and more potent. In 1804, morphine is isolated from opium. In 1832, codeine is isolated from opium. And in 1855, cocaine is isolated from the cocoa plant. So you have these more powerful, more potent drugs. And just as kind of as a historical note, morphine was used in place of opium out of the widespread belief that it lacked opium's addictive properties. And this is a belief, was the first in a long sequence of myths in which nearly every new opium derivative and synthetic narcotic would be considered non-addictive. We see innovations in drug administration. In 1853, the hypodermic needle was invented, and this allowed these more powerful drugs to be delivered in a much more efficient and effective manner. And with any type of innovation, there's always unintended consequence. And one of the unintended consequences was overdose. And sadly, or ironically, Dr. Wood, who invented it, his wife is the first reported person to die of a morphine overdose from injecting morphine. We also saw innovations in drug marketing. During the kind of latter quarter of the 19th century, there was a real growth in newspaper advertising, and this fueled the patent medicine industry. There was also the advent of mail-order catalogs selling drugs and injection equipment directly to people in their homes. So you would see advertising such as this, Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, and it's really marketed towards children. What's not known is that the main ingredient is morphine. You would see advertisements for purchasing syringe through catalogs or through pharmacies. This is pure paregoric. And on it, it says 46% alcohol, 1 3/16 grain of opium. And on the back side of the bottle, it actually lists dosing instructions. And it says 5 days or old, 5 drops, 2 weeks old, 8 drops, 5 years old, 25 drops, and adults a teaspoonful. When we talk to addicts, they usually thought that the instructions said a bottle or 2. This is an advertisement for cocaine at the price of 15 cents, and it says it's for sale by all druggists, which meant that you could just walk into a drugstore and purchase it like an over-the-counter medication. So to provide a little perspective on the rise of addiction during this era, in the 1840s, imported crude opium and smoking opium was about 450,000 pounds annually. And by the 1890s, the annual import of crude opium and smoking opium was 6 million pounds. So you see this, incredible increase in the consumption of opium and opium-based drugs. And interestingly, if you look at this period, who were addicts? During the second half of the 19th century and the early 20th century, most opiate addicts were white middle-aged women from among the most educated and honored members of society. All right, so do you remember that historical note about what we learned about morphine? Well, in 1898, Bayer releases a safer, non-addictive alternative to morphine that goes by the name of heroin. When we talk to people who are impacted by addiction, they often describe this distrust of the pharmaceutical industry, and we see that it has a really long and legitimate history for where that distrust originates from. In response to this rise in addiction, there were addiction cures. Some people with addiction have tried to solve their problem by substituting one drug for another, and that wasn't something that actual drug addicts invented. That's something a doctor invented. In 1878, Dr. Bentley from Kentucky started using cocaine to treat morphine addiction, and over a 2-year period, he prescribed 25 pounds of cocaine in the treatment of morphine addiction. He considered it was a successful treatment because he'd prescribed a pound of cocaine to a woman, and she had written back. And he reports that he'd received a note from her when she had used this, and she was much encouraged and had ordered 2 pounds more. The doctor reported that when he recently saw her, she assured him that she had no desire for morphine anymore. Yeah. Other addiction cures were ones that were marketed in the same way that drugs were marketed, through mail-order catalogs and so forth. And kind of the tragic part of this story is that there were people who were addicted who were sending away for these cures. And all these cures claimed to contain no narcotics and to be non-addicting. So you would see advertisements such as this one Morphine, easy, home cure, painless, and permanent. So you can imagine an individual kind of having their hopes set on here's something that can solve my problem. Or this is an advertisement in Sears Roebuck catalog, cure for the opium and morphia habit, 75 cents, which is, they said, is cheaper than the retail price of $1.50. And they say that it contains no poisonous narcotics. Immediately on taking a dose of this remedy, a calming and soothing effect is produced. It acts as a tonic to the nerves. Its use will completely destroy that terrible craving for morphine in those who are victims to the deadly habit. Now, sadly, what they discovered as they investigated this is that all of these miracle cures contain morphine, sometimes at higher doses than what the individual was already taking. A series of articles appeared in Collier's National Weekly between October 7, 1905 and January 13, 1906 that focused on the patent medicine fraud that was going on. And it's really articles such as this that focused on Death's Laboratory, and it resulted in pressure for the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906, which basically indicated that you had to label what was in a product that somebody was taking. So if something contained alcohol or other drugs, that had to be on the label. Now, the most significant piece of federal legislation occurred a few years later in 1914. It was called the Harrison Anti-Narcotic Act. And what it did is it required anyone involved with the manufacturer, prescribing, or dispensing of narcotics and other drugs to pay a tax and to keep records of their distribution of this. And it basically restricted the use of opiates, cocaine, and other drugs to legitimate medical purposes. So America, after decades of being able to openly access all sorts of drugs through catalog or just walking into the drugstore, could only get them through a physician at this point. So America kind of went from uncontrolled access to access regulated by physicians. And a contemporary example to think about is if there was a law passed saying that people could only purchase nicotine products through prescription from a physician. It would dramatically impact the way that people had access to drugs. In 1915, the Treasury Department started to enforce this act, and they started to dictate to physicians how they could practice medicine. And they told physicians that they could no longer maintain addicts on morphine or other drugs. Some physicians said, you're with the Treasury Department, you don't know medicine. We're physicians and we're going to practice medicine as we see fit. And the Treasury Department brought lawsuits. And finally, in 1919, a Supreme Court ruling, Webb versus the United States, ruled that it was a violation of the Harrison Act for a physician to prescribe morphine to an addict for purposes other than attempting to cure the habit. And so between like 1918 and 1938, more than 25,000 physicians were indicted under the Harrison Act, 3,000 physicians went to jail, and 20,000 paid substantial fines. The liability of treating an addict became too great, and physicians stopped treating their addicted patients. So again, we have this community that addiction arose out of a legally accessible set of drugs. That access is cut off, and local communities are trying to figure out, what do we do with our citizens who are addicted? And decades before methadone maintenance programs, there were communities that established morphine maintenance clinics. These are addicts lined up outside of the Worth Street Morphine Clinic in New York City, where they would come and get a daily dose of morphine. This is a female addict at the New Orleans Morphine Clinic. And this continued until about 1923, when the federal government basically came in and shut down the last of these clinics and said that this goes against the Harrison Act. So there was a real vacuum between 1924 and 1935. The last of the morphine clinics had closed. There was no private treatment facilities. There was increased prosecution and incarceration of addicts. And so what did treatment look like? And the question that we posed early on about what would it have been like to be an addict before Narcotics Anonymous really can be looked at in the next series of slides, particularly during this real vacuum. So there were invasive cures, serum therapies where they would raise blisters on an addict's abdomen and thighs, withdraw the fluid from the blisters and re-inject during withdrawal. There were bromide sleep treatments where 1 in 5 people who took the treatment died from the treatment. There were aversion therapies. Aversion therapies can be thought of as similar to antabuse. The idea behind antabuse is if you drink on it, it makes you sick, so you're not going to drink on it. One of the aversion therapies they used for narcotic addicts was succinylcholine, which created the experience of suffocating. So they would pair an opiate with this drug. The addict would feel like they couldn't breathe, and they would think that that would discourage or dissuade them from future use. There were other things such as apomorphine, which induced nausea, and other psychiatric trends. North Carolina was one of the progressive states with laws providing for the sterilization of the mentally unfit. This targeted addicts, alcoholics, people with mental retardation, with mental illness. There were many addicts, particularly women, who were institutionalized, and their freedom was only granted if they voluntarily submitted to sterilization. And if your liberty is attached to that, it's not really a voluntary decision. There was insulin therapy for morphine addiction. There was a woman, an actress who was diabetic and was also a morphine addict. And to treat her diabetes that was out of control, they accidentally administered too much insulin, and it put her into a coma. But when she came out of the coma, she reported she had no craving for morphine anymore. So they took that one experience and started giving insulin injections to addicts, putting them into coma with the idea that when they'd come out, they wouldn't crave morphine anymore. There was electroshock therapy, such as this addict at the narcotic farm in Lexington, Kentucky. And some of the most barbaric were psychosurgery or lobotomies, where an ice pick goes in through the eye socket into the frontal cortex. And in our research, as we look at this, we really kind of wonder, what would the experience have been like during this era if you were addicted to drugs before Narcotics Anonymous?
And so I've talked to, many members of Narcotics Anonymous, and they tell me when they see this particular section and they learn about all these extreme and evasive cure theories that they had out there, they sure are grateful for the 12-step program that they have today. You and I? There you go. There you go. But as a direct result of the Harrison Act and the criminalization of addiction, what happened is that the federal prison system was starting to get in a new type of prisoner. And that really was the person who was addicted to opiates. And the wardens really just did not know what to do with this particular type of prisoner. They were worried that the addict or the person addicted to opiates would try to smuggle in more opiates and then addict further their population. And so there was a huge lobbying that went on to Congress. And Congress said, we think this might be a problem here. So in 1929, they created a legislation that allowed the U.S. Public Health Hospital to establish 2 narcotic farms, one in Lexington, Kentucky, and then another one in Fort Worth, Texas. Now these narcotic farms. It's a pretty interesting hybrid because Lexington was opened in 1935, and it was open for both men and women. It was under the purview of the U.S. Public Health Hospital, but it was also a federal prison. So you could be sentenced there federally, or you could actually go there voluntarily. Pretty interesting, federal institution, if you ask me. And in 1935, Lexington opens. 2 years later, in 1938, 3 years later, in 38, Fort Worth in Texas opens up. And if you were a male and you lived west of the Mississippi, you went to Fort Worth. And there was only males there. If you lived east of the Mississippi after 1938, you went to Lexington. But if you were a female anywhere in the United States and you wanted to go either sentenced or you wanted to go voluntarily to take the cure, you actually went to Lexington.
What we've discovered through our research are things that we kind of consider to be significant events in the history of Narcotics Anonymous, even though they predate the formation of Narcotics Anonymous. And so the opening of the narcotic farm in Lexington is one of those events that is kind of a critical link in the chain of events.
And please understand, too, that that's our interpretation of significant events.
Another significant event happened a couple weeks before the opening of the narcotic farm on Mother's Day, May 12, 1935. Bill Wilson is 6 months sober, and he's in Akron, Ohio, and he finds himself wanting to take a drink. And unlike his experience with Armistice Day in November of 34, he decides to reach out and ask for help. And he goes down the directory, the church directory in the lobby of the Mayflower Hotel, and he starts calling up churches and asking if there's any drunks that he can talk to. He gets connected with a woman named Henrietta Seiberling, who invites him to come over on Mother's Day to meet Dr. Bob. Dr. Bob was a proctologist who had been involved with the Oxford group, and people had been praying for him to get sober. Dr. Bob, being a friend of Henrietta's, says, me and my wife Ann will come over, but we're only going to stay for 15 minutes. Well, that meeting ended up lasting a reported 6 hours, and the discovery was that Bill didn't go there to talk to Bob about Bob's drinking. Bill went there to talk to Bob about his own drinking, hoping that Bob would identify, and through that identification, Bill would find the support that and the understanding that he would need not to take a drink that day. And what happened for Bob, it was the first time that somebody came to him and talked drunk to a drunk, instead of coming praying for him or preaching to him or trying to persuade him. And Bob found the identification necessary to have some hope for himself. And as a result of their meeting, a fellowship and a program formed that offers the first real hope of recovery for alcoholics. That's really based on this idea of one alcoholic talking to another in order to stay sober themselves and carrying the message to those who still suffer.
What is the most resilient parasite? Bacteria? A virus? An intestinal worm?
What Mr. Cobb is trying to say.
An idea. Resilient, highly contagious. Once an idea has taken hold of the brain, it's almost impossible to eradicate. An idea that is fully formed, fully understood, that sticks. Right in there somewhere.
This clip from the movie Inception kind of spoke to Boyd and I about the idea that Bob and Bill came upon. And this presentation is really based around tracing how this idea that Bill and Bob discovered was transmitted from alcoholics to addicts. The same principles of one addict talking to another to stay clean themselves and carrying the message. And we talked about the narcotic farm, and one of the reasons that we say it's a significant place is that this becomes ground zero for the transmission of the Alcoholics Anonymous program to drug addicts. We do have a couple of pictures to give you a sense of what the narcotic farm looked like. It was a massive working farm, but again, as Boyd mentioned, it was also a prison, so you had correctional officers and you had addicts who were experiencing confinement and incarceration.